Senior U.S. military officers and senior civilians in the Defense Department, really senior, like people who serve on the Joint Chiefs, people who are secretaries of the various branches of the military, I have been able to meet and interview and get to know more of them than you'd think. I wrote a book about the military a decade or so ago, and that started a process in which I met a lot of these folks, and it's been an honor. And while folks at that very senior level come from all sorts of different backgrounds, they come to those leadership positions through all sorts of different routes. By the time any of them have served at the most senior ranks of the military and the Defense Department, I think one of the things you can say about all of them in unison is that they are measured. They are calm. The word unflappable is almost right, but it feels like it needs a more worrying root word than flap, right? These are people who are like epically even-keeled. And that is why I asked to be on the show tonight the man who, until last month, served as Secretary of the United States Air Force. His name is Frank Kendall. He is a West Point graduate, an Army veteran, a former Undersecretary of Defense, and for the last 4 years, he was Secretary of the United States Air Force. He is not a flappable man. And yet, Friday night, President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced the sudden and unexplained removal of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the senior lawyers, the senior legal officers in the Air Force and the Army and the Navy. Now, Frank Kendall responded to that in writing. And what he wrote, to me, is the unflappable veteran defense official version of an air raid siren. Just listen to this. Quote, President Trump's decision to fire senior military leaders without cause is foolish and a disgrace. It politicizes our professional military in a dangerous and debilitating way. What frightens me most is the removal of 3 judge advocates general, the most senior uniformed legal authorities in the Defense Department. Their removal is one more element of this administration's attack on the rule of law, and an especially disturbing part. The military's top judge advocates general are the senior military professionals who interpret and enforce the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the rules that guide troops in the field. They have the independent legal authority to tell any military commander or political appointee that an order from the President or the Secretary of Defense is unlawful, cannot be given, and should not be obeyed. Mr. Trump and Mr. Hegseth will now get to choose the JAG leadership for all 3 military departments. One has to ask why JAG leadership was singled out for replacement. This is part of a much larger pattern of disrespect, even disdain for the rule of law. If there is one characteristic of this president and this administration, it is the utter lack of respect for legal constraints. Kendall says, quote, we are in danger when the legal constraints on how the president uses the military, including within the United States, are ignored or brushed aside. Our country is in uncharted territory. We have an administration that is waging war against the rule of law. The evidence is everywhere. We don't yet know how far it will go as it seeks to control, reinterpret, rewrite, ignore, or defy legal constraints, including the Constitution itself. He concludes with this. The replacement of the military JAG leadership is one skirmish in that war, but it is time for the American people across the political spectrum to recognize what is happening. Quote, America has a rogue president and a rogue administration, and we need to acknowledge that and respond. Joining us now is Frank Kendall, who until last month was Secretary of the United States Air Force. Secretary Kendall, it is a real honor to have some time with you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. Great to be with you.
Am I right to read this as you essentially sending an alert that although, to civilians, this might not have registered at first glance like the biggest deal, given everything else, you're essentially telling the public this is a very big deal and one that needs a response?
It is a big deal, and I chose my words carefully and very thoughtfully. I felt that in the announcements about the people being replaced, that the removal of the judge advocate generals, the head lawyers for each of the services, was not getting the attention that it deserved. And I really wanted to call some attention to that because of the implications that could possibly have.
In terms of the removal of those legal officers, I found it striking that in the announcement about their removal, they weren't even named. implying that they were removed as a class of people rather than as individual public servants and officers who were removed for some specific reason as to how they were doing their job. What is the thing you most worry about in terms of replacing senior legal military officers at this level and doing so as a group?
First of all, I have a lot of confidence in our Judge Advocate General. This is a class of very professional people. I've worked with them over most of my career in a number of different capacities, and I've seen what they can do. What I'm concerned about, though, here is that there'll be some effort to find people who are going to be very compliant with whatever the administration wants to do. Secretary Hegseth has made some public comments about this. He's talked about, JAGs constraining operators excessively when they're engaged in combat. That's a concern that lower-ranking people might have about not being allowed to use as much firepower as they'd like, for example. But the rules of engagement, the rules of armed conflict, and so on are there for a reason, and they have to be followed by people. And we use the JAGs to help enforce that. That's one aspect of it. But there are a number of other things that the JAGs would be able to pronounce judgments on, and again, have legal authority over people in uniform. And that includes, as you mentioned, the use of the military within the United States against American citizens. There are legal constraints on how the military can be used. But as with all laws, they're subject to interpretation. So I'm concerned about the direction in which this is heading. This wasn't part of the DEI, war against DEI that's being waged. The JAGs really have no role in that. These are not people who have, other than fairly narrow responsibilities, well down within the structure of each of the services. So it really struck me as unusual and hard to understand why these particular people would be singled out for replacement.
When you said America has a rogue president and a rogue administration, I'd like to hear how you define those terms and what you mean by that. I take you at your word that you chose those words very carefully, but you followed that assertion immediately with, we need to acknowledge that and respond. So I'd also like to hear from you what you think the appropriate response is.
First of all, we're seeing a number of behaviors, and not just these of the military and so on, but we're seeing the use of a non-government employee, a billionaire, to come in and pretty much wreak havoc with the entire federal government apparatus. We're seeing declarations of things like birthright citizenship no longer being valid under the Constitution. So there's a large range of things. Not following the law and relieving the inspector generals that were relieved. I think your previous guest mentioned that there are 75 lawsuits going on right now. President Trump made the comment recently that, if you're saving the nation, you're above the law, words to that effect. These are dangerous things to hear from an American president, and the conduct has been very consistent. So I think rogue is a reasonable description. I think it's an apt description. And I think it should make us all concerned as citizens. Whatever our views on various issues, we all should believe in the rule of law. It's the most fundamental American principle. It distinguishes us from, almost any totalitarian state, certainly. And so we should all be united in saying, wait a minute, whatever our differences may be, if we can pursue those, we can debate, we can have processes play out to try to resolve those differences, but we have to do that within the law. That is so fundamental to the existence of our democracy and to our freedom as citizens that I think every American should recognize that that's a concern.
Frank Kendall, former Undersecretary of Defense, until last month, Secretary of the United States Air Force. Sir, thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for helping us understand this tonight. And thank you for writing this in the blunt terms that you did. At least for me, it really broke through and it made me understand this in a way that I didn't previously. And it's scary to me, but I appreciate your expertise. Thank you.
It's a scary time, Rachel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. As the daughter of a former Air Force JAG in particular, I got to say, oof.